So, Hogwarts Legacy is a thing, and it's caused quite the stir, hasn't it? Mostly because J.K. Rowling is a very controversial figure these days. But to give my take, you're entirely within your right to boycott the game, but I do find that to be a futile gesture when J.K. Rowling is already a billionaire. So any amount of boycott won't hurt her bottom line. It's more likely to hurt the bottom line of the hundreds upon hundreds of other people who are involved with the game. They might be relying on it being a success to feed their families. While the books are written by one person, the movies and the games have a lot more hands working on them. And attributing it to one person is somewhat ignorant in my opinion, but if you do choose to boycott, take the money that you would have spent on the game and donate it to a worthy cause, because then that might actually make a difference. Me personally, I'll probably buy it when it goes down to like $10, not out of any altruistic reasons, mostly because I'm not as big of a fan of Harry Potter as I used to be, so I'm not willing to spend the big bucks. With that said, I grew up with these movies, and I mean that in the most literal sense, as I watched the first movie when I was like 4 or 5, and actually grew up with these characters. But once the final movie was out, it was hard to maintain my enthusiasm for the franchise, which is just the natural result of growing up. But it's been a long road to get to Hogwarts Legacy because Harry Potter as a series has probably had more video game adaptations per capita than any other film franchise ever. Although don't quote me on that. Which is funny because most of these games were kind of terrible, but unlike many other similar franchises that got multiple tie-in games, the Harry Potter games actually did start out pretty great, but gradually got worse over time. Okay, well to say they were pretty great is probably a bit of a stretch. The very first game, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, or Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone if you will, wasn't the most amazing game. In fact, it was a very standard type of game for its time. Sort of an exploratory platformer collectathon with combat elements. Very PS1. It makes sense, this was basically just the default state of games back in the day. The major flaw with the progression is that it was largely just one fetch quest after another to move the plot along, as for some reason they couldn't quite figure out any other way to make it work. And there were far too many minigames, many of which weren't very good. There's some diamonds in the rough here and there, don't get me wrong, such as the entirely separate Quidditch mode, which has smooth and intuitive controls and a simple but compelling goal to work towards with the controlled flying through rings. Did I mention that this was made by the same people who made Star Fox? This, unlike Superman 64, works because the controls work. The only thing I don't appreciate is the fact that you literally can't lose, it's just about getting the best time. But then you have all these crappy minigames, like the troll fight, which might as well just be a turret section, or potions class, which is just a quick time event sequence. Lame. There's also plenty of other optional minigames you can find in order to get the famous Wizards and Witches cards, but the minigames themselves aren't good enough for me to feel any desire to play through every single one of them just for the cards. I'd much rather just collect the cards that are available in the general gameplay, because the general exploration, minor puzzle solving, and platforming creates a fun, albeit not mind-blowing experience. And there is a collectathon element in that depending on where you are in the game, you can collect different colored beans and trade them to Fred and George for the passwords to various portraits, which will give you upgrades and prizes. Granted, there aren't too many mechanics in this game, so the upgrades you get are kind of token. As a matter of fact, one of them is just a card. But it does at least create a reason to go around and explore, so I find that the moment-to-moment gameplay of platforming / light combat and exploration is stimulating enough that I'm entertained relatively well. In particular, I enjoy these timed platforming sequences for getting to class on time. They were always a highlight. And the one thing this game, and subsequently its sequel as well, absolutely nails is the atmosphere. The atmosphere in these games is as thick as mustard gas in your lungs. There are a few moments that really stick out to me, but this one moment is entrenched in my memory like a humpback whale resting on my shoulders. God, you can feel that. Other moments that really stick out in my mind are the dungeons. I speak no hyperbole when I say the dungeons used to scare the crap out of me. Okay, maybe a little bit of hyperbole. Particularly that one puzzle where you have to hunt the different colored eyeballs. I used to dread doing this part of the game. A lot of the atmosphere comes down to the soundtrack, which is super distinctive and well composed. It's by the same guy who did the soundtrack for things like The Elder Scrolls, Jeremy Soule. Granted, I can't exactly praise this game too hard, considering it does have some pretty hefty flaws. The presentation all around is kind of horrid. Even for the standards of the time, this game is butt ugly. but it does kinda give it a weird sort of charm. I mean, there's a reason why PS1 Hagrid has become such a meme to this day. Then there's also the voice acting, which is so bad it's almost comical.
Out of my way, Harry! There's a huge monster down there!
But it's a neat little game. Not perfect, but it has a lot of merit. The sequel, Chamber of Secrets, is more of the same, although it has less horrid minigames and expands upon the primary gameplay loop, particularly with these wizard duels, which are probably my favorite thing in the entire game. It's just so addicting. And there's a general improvement to the minigames that are there, such as the ever-amusing gnome tossing. That one, I never got tired of. They also made the castle itself much bigger, which meant that the exploration could really come to the forefront more so than it did before. This castle is just crawling with secret spaces to go through. Little challenges, combat encounters, you name it. And I do love just going around and finding all the secrets. There's one particular spot in this game that, no joke, is one of my favorite spots just in any game ever. In one of the secret challenge areas, you find your way to the absolute top of the castle, and something about this scenic view of a PS1 sunset atop the castle just feels so cozy to me. I don't know why, this spot just always stuck with me as a sentimental favorite moment in the history of gaming. So it's for the little moments like that which really makes the exploration worth it, and I really like how you can freely explore the castle grounds as you wish, and you'll even come across a lot of doors that you'll never have access to. It makes this feel like much more of an actual school. That always intrigued me back in elementary school, seeing all those secret locked doors that I would never have hoped to access, which led to all those mysterious areas. It really piqued the imagination of a child, and I feel like these games capture that feeling. Although as far as the layout of the grounds, it really doesn't follow any specific design pattern. It's just a series of corridors laid out seemingly randomly, and there's a lot of quirky video game-ness to that design, because you see things that would never in any sane world be laid out the way they are. Like how the path to the Slytherin common room is this arcane obstacle course. The dungeons have these like pits of lava or something, or you have these really intricately laid out back rooms with locked doors and bottomless pits. I'm surprised you don't come across a few corpses while you're here. Or like how in the first game, the only way to access the upper areas of the upper castle is via a flying table with a gap you have to jump across. That must be a pain in the ass for people like Filch. It's strangely charming how surreal this world can be in that sense. This is the world that these people exist in, but it just so happens that the video game aspects took center stage, which I think is the right attitude to have when making an adaptation, and I think that Chamber of Secrets is definitely an improvement over its predecessor. It has a grander scope with more interesting and intricate puzzles and platforming sequences, exploration, combat, some interesting additions via the spells. It's a pretty solid ride. All the quirks are still there, horrible voice acting, horrible graphics, and so on and so on and so on. But I can't bring myself to hate Chamber of Secrets. It's honestly one of my most replayed games of all time. I played it at least 10 times when I was a kid. It's not the most amazing game, but it is a sentimental favorite. Now, I've been covering the PS1 games up until now. However, different consoles had different versions made by different teams. The PS1 games were developed by Argonaut, whereas the next-gen versions were made by EA UK. And it's not a Tony Hawk situation where the last-gen version and next-gen versions are essentially the same. No, they are basically entirely different games. Obviously, the presentation is a big step up. Graphically, I think this game still holds up surprisingly well. I'm playing this 3 times upscaled to 1080p, but I think the character models are sharp and kind of have an action figure visual style to them, which is still surprisingly appealing. As for the game, it handles itself in a very similar fashion to the PS1 games, but takes a much different approach. How so? Well, first of all, where the PS1 games at times were just a series of plot beats connected by gameplay with the whole school thing, sometimes taking a back seat, the school aspect plays, in my estimation, a much more significant amount of importance here. Each class you do is a series of challenge rooms where you can pick up challenge tokens. The more you pick up, the better grade you get and the more house points you get. I'm not sure if the house points are relevant because I'm pretty sure you win the house cup either way. But regardless, these are areas that are sequence after sequence of satisfying mechanical challenges that serve to introduce further mechanics which expands the gameplay meaningfully, whether it be as a means to use in combat or puzzles. The PS1 games did of course have classes, but the house point relevant parts were mostly just QTE sequences, with the spells you learned often only playing into a single challenge before moving on to something unrelated. But in fairness, when they did do specific challenge sequences for the classes, they were also good more often than not. But I think the next-gen versions just do them way better. And I think the PS1 games had a tendency to have additions which were slightly token, whereas all the spells fit naturally into your repertoire here and gradually open up the world in a meaningful way. I would honestly compare these games to a 3D Legend of Zelda, although I wouldn't say it's nearly that good. The overall difference between the last gen and next gen version of Sorcerer's Stone, or Philosopher's Stone, I really don't know which, is that the PS1 games were more platformers, whereas the next gen versions really emphasize the exploration. They give you free reign to explore between major plot beats, and there's a lot to find. In the PS1 games, the famous Wizards and Witches cards were one of a kind each, whereas there's an entire trading card system here, which means there's a bunch of secret areas to explore and find new cards. So many that you'll often double up, and you can trade cards for other cards. In fact, the exploration is so hard-coded into the game's DNA that it will often give you fetch quests to go on between major plot beats. You need ingredients for potions class, but you'll be responsible for getting them in your own time. I was honestly under the assumption that the game was going to have me find these ingredients as part of the critical path, but it didn't. It left me to my own devices. It told me the general area to find the ingredients, but trusted me to work out the details, and I appreciate a game that doesn't hold your hand like that. You could explore the PS1 games to find secrets, but the critical path was essentially linear, whereas this game is far more open. And it's nice to be able to explore a rough estimation of the movie's set before they redesigned it and gave it a definitive layout with the third movie. But I'm not sure if these aspects of the game were emphasized intentionally, or if it's because they realized the other aspects weren't that good. When you're charging up your Flipendo spell, for whatever reason the game locks you in a strafe while you're charging it. Which works if there are enemies in front of you, but if there are enemies running all around you, which they usually will be, that will pose an issue. That is unless you're targeting an enemy, but for whatever reason, the button to target just didn't work for me half the time. Could not tell you why. What's worse, to cycle through targets you have to keep clicking the button. That is asinine 10 and 11. Why not just cycle through targets using the D-pad? Because what makes one target more next than the others? It's a momentary hang-up that can be the difference maker in getting hit and not getting hit. And there's also a short delay between pressing the button and the spell being cast, which makes the combat somewhat sticky. The combat overall is a bit rough in these games. Not a deal breaker by any means, but not great. And another thing these games really fail at is stealth. It's really shithouse. They encourage you to sneak around, but it's so easy to just cheese this by running around them. I also found that the ratio of actually doing things to walking to places / talking isn't great. There's a little bit too much inaction, if you catch me. But if you just want to say fuck it and do your own thing, you can. After a certain point, you can get on your broomstick and fly around the entire grounds. And my god, if I had this game at 8 years old, I would have literally done this for hours. That would be a dream come true. Even now, it's absorbing to just fly around and look for secrets. Unfortunately, they kind of ruin or de-emphasize quite a bit of what made this game good in the next-gen version of Chamber of Secrets. No more doubling up on cards, so the exploration isn't as fruitful. A lot of the grounds have been truncated, so you just teleport from key location to key location, which certainly saves on time, but I was fine with the commute because it was more immersive, and it also means you can't explore the grounds fully, which is a really dumb decision. The entire school has been modeled, and you can still fly around freely once you get the Nimbus 2000, but for some reason you just can't land anywhere other than the predetermined landing areas. Although apparently this was a specific change to the GameCube and Xbox ports. Without freeform exploration, much of the core gameplay feels like a series of fetch quests. This is especially prevalent in the Diagon Alley sequence, where you have to go from store to store retrieving Ginny's things and then getting your own things. It's really boring. This is part of the game's intro. What a way to start off. You also lose beans every time you get hit, so in your haste to pick them back up, you'll probably get hit again, which is yet another annoyance. And don't even get me started on these climbing sections. I maxed out my beans before this climbing section and left that section with none. Then if you get caught during stealth sections, you'll lose precious house points, which may or may not matter. Which would be more of an issue if the stealth, as I mentioned, wasn't complete tripe, so I guess that balances itself out. It's weird, I guess they got notes from the QA testers to quote-unquote improve the game, but it really only just made it worse. Then the new additions aren't great, like this game's version of Wizard Duels. which feels like that one sequence in the final boss of Ocarina of Time, except if it were played at half speed. This is actually one of the recurring gameplay themes with other enemies, though it did lead to a funny moment where my game got soft-locked. Now that's funny. It's still by no means a bad game, and I'm probably sounding more negative or nitpicky than I'm intending, but that's not the intention, because the things that were good are still good, and the things that were bad are still bad. It just so happens that there's also enough newly established bad and no newly established good, so I can't help but sound more negatively disposed towards this game. Because to go over what I liked about it would be repeating myself. It has the bones of what I liked about Philosopher's Stone, and the classes are still a highlight, but it definitely doesn't match up with that game. I was originally just gonna play the next-gen version of Philosopher's Stone for a couple hours to get an impression of it, but I found myself playing through the entire thing. Chamber of Secrets, though, I found it hard to maintain that enthusiasm. The first two games had different versions that were developed or ported by different teams, and each different version was unique. But from Prisoner of Azkaban onward, the non-handheld versions of the games were pretty much all developed by EA UK, aka EA Brightlight. Seeing as Prisoner of Azkaban is made by the same people who made the next-gen console versions of the first two games, this is more of the same, but that's by no means a bad thing. They continue to build on the formulas that they established in the first two games, creating arguably the best game in this particular chunk of the series, possibly in the overall series. It's pretty much the same idea, light combat, exploration, platforming, the works. Everything that I didn't like about Chamber of Secrets has now been removed or truncated, including the grounds being fully explorable again, and in fact they once again work in the explorative elements, like looking for ingredients for potions class. What this game does that the games before or after didn't is that it utilizes the idea that you have three characters tied at the hip. You start off and already each character has unique characteristics. Ron can find secrets, Hermione can squeeze through tight spaces, and Harry has Marauder's map and can see where secrets are. So you already have a unique set of characteristics that forces you to think about how you're going to interact with the world around you. But then as you go through, different characters will learn different spells, meaning that gradually as time goes on, you need to think more and more critically about how to approach the combat and puzzles, making for some creative combat and good head-scratching puzzles at times. Sometimes you might need to combine the abilities of characters, and sometimes only certain characters can attack certain enemies. In fact, there are so many unique abilities between the characters that some actually get lost in the shuffle. Like how Harry can climb rope, but the space of time between Harry needing to climb rope is like 3 hours at one point, which means I completely forgot he could. As a matter of fact, I don't think he needs to climb anything after this. The main meat of the game is definitely in these classes, which are the same as before, just a fun series of mechanical challenges, but they're actually a lot grander than the previous games, with each specific class taking upwards of an hour or more, which I actually really appreciate because it's EA UK emphasizing the best parts of the game. Sometimes it can be a little bit too big, so it's not really obvious where to go next, but the fun definitely balances out. Then I gotta say, I'm really happy they gave you the ability to freely fly around on Buckbeak. It's functionally the same as flying around on a broomstick, but I remember thinking how awesome that would be when I used to watch the film, and since this replaces the broomstick as a means to fly around, that also means you don't have to worry about playing the Quidditch minigame, which I'm fine with because I think the next-gen Quidditch minigames were not great. So yeah, I think this is a vast improvement over the last two games. It can't help but end on a bit of an anticlimax though, since the final chunk of the story isn't really that action heavy, so you find yourself just casting spells at a crowd of Dementors. Then you have to rescue Sirius Black from the prison tower, but even then there's a lot of missed opportunities here for a climactic final sequence. There's no boss fight against the Weeping Willow for example, and when they travel back in time they skip straight to the scene at the lake. They compress a lot of time that could have been a fun opportunity to play around with the whole being in two places at once thing. But that probably would have meant stealth, and the stealth, as I've already pointed out, is kind of balls in these games, but it would have been something more than just skipping over like half an hour of action. So the game ends a bit disappointingly, but overall it's a solid time. Nostalgia aside, definitely the best game I've played so far. And this is where things get a little bit weird because I feel like they had a pretty decent working formula. A semi-adaptation of the movies that turns certain scenes from those movies and also the books into action scenes to justify gameplay, sprinkled in with their own ideas. You explore the castle, you have combat elements, you have platforming. It's something that was not without its merit and certainly had proven itself to be at least fairly fun. So for some reason, they decided to throw that all in the bin and make Goblet of Fire into an isometric dungeon crawler. Well, okay, not what I would have chosen, but fine. This game is a weird anomaly as far as the entire series is concerned. There's really no attempt to adapt anything from the movie outside of the Triwizard Cup. You have to play through various locations and find Triwizard shields. The more you find, the more locations you open up. And get this, each environment has several you need to collect. So you have to keep going back to the earlier levels in order to unlock the later levels, which means backtracking and repetition. All my Christmases coming at once. So there's only like 8 levels in total, 3 of which are the Triwizard Cup levels, and 1 of which is the final boss. That's the impression I get from the level name anyway. It might not even be a true final boss. I didn't play long enough to find out. I played for a couple hours and just found myself so deathly bored that I could not bring myself to continue. The main levels have gameplay that can be best described as complete white noise. You walk around and cast spells. If it's not your main combat spell, you'll press the button for the context-specific magic spell, whether that be to make an enemy vulnerable or to get past a hazard. Failing that, you occasionally press the button to go Super Saiyan. There's nothing challenging about this. You don't have to put any thought in, and the combat is really easy, but not just easy, it also doesn't look or feel good to pull off. Then the levels are flat and uninteresting. There's just nothing about this that really excites me or interests me. You walk around and press buttons. I tried playing as far as the first Triwizard Cup level, only to find out that they turned it into a Space Harrier minigame. Wow. It was such a boneheaded decision to change the gameplay up so drastically. I think Goblet of Fire could have been the perfect game to adapt into that style, and I think it could have benefited more than any previous game from expanding on the formula as yet established. The Triwizard Cup is almost tailor-made for the action-adventure platforming thing they had going. The dragon portion speaks for itself. Imagine if they had this as a giant combat scenario with like added combat elements to the broomstick flying. That would have been a great addition. I guess for what it's worth, the concept of a 3D platformer like this was probably pretty outdated by 2005, but at least it's the devil you know. And I wouldn't have minded so much if the change to the game was fun, but it really wasn't. Now, I'm not sure why they changed the gameplay styles so thoroughly, but something tells me that EA UK probably looked at that and thought, yeah, maybe that wasn't the greatest idea, and decided to correct course with Order of the Phoenix. Unfortunately, it feels like they overcorrected in a great many ways. Now, before I rag on this game, there are a few things that I can actually give it credit for. They allow you to freely roam around the entire castle, and they made it a one-to-one digital replica of the actual castle from the later movies, unlike Prisoner of Azkaban, which took some liberties. Also, this is a much higher quality version of the same castle. And there was a certain novelty, especially back in 2007, in being able to freely wander around the actual Hogwarts castle and see all the nooks and crannies that you only got glimpses of in the movies. It would be nice to fly around on a broomstick like the first couple games, but they didn't add that, so whoop-de-doo. Plus, the spellcasting was overhauled. Instead of having spells be contextual or selectable, you actually cast different spells by moving the right analog stick in specific patterns, much in the same way that you would do tricks in the EA Skate series. It means you can't control the camera, but... actually, I don't have a counterpoint to that. The different spells you can cast also play into the sandbox elements of the game, wherein all over the castle you'll find things that aren't the way they should be. Items are broken, portraits have fallen off the walls, and so on. So you have to tidy up the castle, which gives you experience that levels up your spells. Not that I ever noticed a difference, and it gives you various bonuses. It's not much, but it gives you something to do in the moment-to-moment gameplay between major events. That said, the things I like about the game pretty much begin and end there. There's a good foundation here, but they don't do anything with it. You mostly just spend the main thrust of the game doing fetch quests for people, so we're harkening back to the first game in that regard. Except much worse. I would say you spend at least half the game recruiting people into the DA or getting them back after the jig is up, and for most of the people you recruit, you have to do a favor for them, which always devolves into a really overlong scavenger hunt. In their defense, it's not like this was the most action-heavy entry in the series, but to immediately walk back my defense, that's probably a good reason not to try and make a completely accurate adaptation of the movie then. These are so boring, and too many of them devolve into climbing, and I've seen stair lifts that go faster than this. Also, special shout out to that one mission where you have to find 5 gargoyles around the entire castle and aren't given any specific directions on where to find them. I had to look that one up because I could not be bothered to find them on my own. I like the duel system, but you don't do it nearly enough. You can get into a duel anytime you want, so long as you're in an open area, but there is an issue. When you're in the story, you'll usually be fighting enough people that it's actually a decent challenge, but when you're just getting into random encounters, you'll never fight more than 2 people from what I've seen, meaning that the most interesting aspect of the game is only interesting in the mandatory fights. It really does feel like a complete and total overcorrection of the last game in all the worst ways, but it's not something that couldn't work with more compelling content. As a matter of fact, I would say that Goblet of Fire and Order of the Phoenix kind of create an interesting yin-yang. In the former's case, you have a game that uses the framework of the thing it's adapting to create something generally original, and in the latter's case, you have a game that attempts to be a faithful adaptation of the source material. Both, however, fail for different reasons. Goblet of Fire just isn't a very fun game fundamentally, whereas Order of the Phoenix could have been fun if they focused more on it being an original game and less on a faithful adaptation of the movie. Order of the Phoenix just didn't have that much to work with, so it might have been a flawed concept from the beginning. However, they weren't quite done with the Order of the Phoenix gameplay style and decided to further build upon it in the next game, the Half-Blood Prince. Well, sort of. This game feels like a step in the right direction in some ways, but also feels like a vast step back in a lot of other ways. In the last game, you were just doing fetch quests and favors to get people on your side, and here they kind of do something similar, except instead of giving you the option to explore and find people organically, it's the same gameplay but as a linear series of tasks, to the point where the ability to explore the castle is somewhat superfluous. Minus some extra duel challenges and potion challenges and whatnot, which is a shame because I actually think the castle this time around is much more fun to explore. It has a mood and an atmosphere that we haven't really felt since the first couple of PS1 games, and I can't quite put my finger on why that is exactly. Now, if I were to point out a few things that I really liked about Half-Blood Prince, first of all is the potions minigame. There's a lot of potions you have to mix throughout the story, and they do it through this very challenging minigame with a lot of moving pieces. You need to identify the right substance and mix in the correct amount, you may need to stir the pot, you may need to turn up the heat, and you may need to shake the bottles before adding them to the mixture. And for everything you add, you need to make sure the potion is the correct color before proceeding, otherwise you'll cause the room to fill with smoke, which costs you precious time. Yeah, this is all done on a time limit. It's surprisingly challenging, and there's enough room for intuition that it makes for a really surprisingly addictive minigame. The second major thing I like is that navigating the castle is significantly easier, mostly because they actually give you a run button. And oh my god, that run cycle. Look at him go. I laughed my ass off the first time I saw this. It reminds me of, and this is a deep cut, a game that me and my chums colloquially call the GoPro game. It's that Dungeons & Dragons game that was announced at the Game Awards, I want to say 2019, where they seemingly filmed it by strapping GoPros onto the weapons of all the people in the trailer, so it just looks absurd. And this is equally absurd. Just look at this. Harry's head doesn't move. I was trying to see if I could swing the camera around because I wanted to get a good head-on look of Harry running so I could recreate that one Linkara clip. Incidentally, I know Linkara says that clip ruined his career. On the contrary, this is the only reason I even know who Linkara is. And because of the fast movement speed and the extremely linear progression, this game moves at a breakneck pace, it must be said. And at 3 hours and change, that certainly speaks true of the game's progression. Finally, this game seemingly takes inspiration from Super Mario Galaxy of all things. You remember how you could wave your cursor at things in Super Mario Galaxy to get star pieces? Well, this game does something similar, where if you see something glowing in the environment, you can tap the right analog stick upwards twice to get environmental items to splooge mini crest pieces all over you, those being the small version of this game's main collectible, which replaces the various random environmental tasks from the last game. I like that it gives you a reason to explore, but I honestly prefer the environmental aspects from the last game because that at least made you think for a second about which spell to use and gave you rewards for being a good Samaritan. Oh my dear, I've accidentally jumped into the negatives for this game, haven't I? Well, the duels are back, and they're way worse. They're more fluid, but with that, I found them extremely easy to cheese. I found that if you use any number of the spells that stun the opponent, you can just spam Stupefy and the fight is over bar the crying. And once you unlock the charged Stupefy, Christ, you can practically take out half their health bar in one go. Then there's the Quidditch minigame. They never really found a way to make the most out of the Quidditch minigame in the main series. Here they just turn it into a really boring Space Harrier minigame, much like the dragon fight in Goblet of Fire, except now you have to do it like 5 or 6 times. Not only that, but you have to do a warm-up game before every main game. So you actually have to play it twice for every one Quidditch game you have to play. It's so boring, so drawn out, there's no thought to it. I absolutely despise this anytime it comes up. As for the main game, I just found it to be boring, honestly. A fast pace can't help the fact that there's nothing really going on in this gameplay. You basically just meander from place to place and occasionally have something moderately interesting happen, but most of the time it's just going to the next area. And you can't even explore the whole castle off the bat because despite being a short game, they had to limit the exploration for a good chunk so they could railroad you more. I mean, you don't even learn that many spells because there are so few tasks that actually require them. The part of this game that exemplifies the Nothing Burger progression more than any, in my opinion, is the part where Harry drinks the liquid luck. The game then walks you to your destination by itself, only being interrupted by a fight with Crabbe and Goyle. Oh my god, this was one of the most excruciatingly boring sections in any game I've ever played. They just force you to watch this entire journey. Surprisingly, despite reviewing better than Order of the Phoenix, I actually think the Half-Blood Prince is the slightly worse game, and that's mostly down to the fact that they refined the game mechanically but couldn't find anything to do with those mechanics, even more so than Order of the Phoenix. And this is where things get really interesting, because the Deathly Hallows Part 1 and 2 both have separate tie-in games, and they both, to put it kindly, suck deep-fried skunk butt. The Harry Potter games have been many things: 3D platformers, isometric dungeon crawlers, open-world scavenger hunts, but one direction I could never imagine them taking would be a third-person shooter. No, I'm serious. The way this game operates is that your wand functions like a gun with different spells acting as different styles of guns. Rapid fire, slow powerful shots, sniper shots, and even a stand-in for an RPG. It's a Harry Potter third-person shooter. Christ, this is surreal. But it's also a really lousy third-person shooter. The shooting itself has no impact, it feels like you're shining laser pointers at each other, and there are so many samey enemies, so it becomes a mundane slog in a very short amount of time. They even introduced cover mechanics, but I rarely needed it, as most individual enemies aren't that much of a threat, and even in large groups, you can just put a wall between you and them. They say you can also use cover by using Wingardium Leviosa on various physics objects, but there are so few objects you can actually pick up that it's really not worth it to switch to that spell. So you just point and shoot, nothing more to it than that. Though I will say, being able to blow the crap out of Dolores Umbridge with my own hands was satisfying as hell. You also have RPG elements, but they don't really play into things. You learn spells as you level up, but all the important ones you get on the critical path. They say you have increased health and deal greater damage as you level up, but it's never to such an extent that I notice. So the combat is boring, but the first thing you'll notice when you turn the game on is that the field of view is so impossibly narrow, to the point where I can hardly see anything, so things are constantly sneaking up on me. This is even worse when we ourselves have to sneak. This game is very stealth heavy, and with that, the rarely used invisibility cloak gets time to shine. Sometimes you can get caught and still accomplish your tasks so long as you can avoid getting hit by all the hazards around you, but sometimes it's an instant game over. Sometimes you can recharge the invisibility cloak's power by standing still for a while, which takes an excruciatingly long time and further kills the already slow pace, but other times it'll drain anyway, and I'm not sure what the variable is. You can fully replenish it by taking it off and putting it back on again, but that might get you caught. You'll also get caught if you bump into someone, and if you're caught, every enemy in the hemisphere knows exactly where you are. The stealth is easily the worst part of the game. It's so slow, getting caught is way too easy, and the tasks you need to accomplish in stealth mode can be really irritating. Needing to wait for someone to be far away enough from key targets in order to steal their identity, for example. This game is just not very well built. I mean, fundamentally it's not awful, it's just so painfully generic at best. But where this game goes from generic to just plain excruciating is in the padding. You can tell they were really struggling to adapt the movie into a feature-length video game, hence it opening up on an adaptation of The Flight to the Burrow being adapted into a turret section. What a great way to start the game off. And dear God, seeing Voldemort fly like Superman is one of the most hilariously surreal things I've seen today. Then you really get a sense for the desperation when they start with the non-story based missions. You know how some games will give you side missions to complete as a bonus to the main content? Well, I think they were planning on doing that here because you have what feel like side missions, except it's not optional. Between main levels, they give you 3 missions to do and tell you can do them in any order. And if you tilt your head slightly, you'll notice it spells out the phrase desperately contrived padding. They were probably originally going to be optional until they realized the game was shorter than they intended, but as a result, they're just so arbitrary and disconnected. I'd also like to make special mention of this one environment that looks to be taking place in a nuclear power plant. This is not a Harry Potter environment. This is a Call of Duty level. The other levels at least make a token effort to seem fantastical, but this is way too grounded. But yeah, you'll be tasked with doing 1 or 2 story missions, and then they'll throw a wall of side missions for you to do before you can continue with the main plot. And they literally drop you right where the main plot was happening after you're done with the side missions, as if nothing happened because nothing did happen. The best part is, they reuse other levels. They might put you in a different part of the level, but it's the same level. This slows the game's already crawling pace to a stall. And it was the 3rd time the plot was interrupted with these boring, inane, completely arbitrary tasks that I decided, screw this, I'm done. I already know how this ends, and I'm not wasting any more time on it. I really wouldn't have minded if the story mode was short, but once you combine a really dull core gameplay with forced padding, I know I'm wasting my time. And that brings us to the final entry of these games, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2. What did I do to deserve this? Okay, well, in all honesty, many have gone on record as saying that this is the worst game in the main series. I actually disagree with that. I actually think this game is marginally better than Deathly Hallows Part 1. Marginally. Granted, Deathly Hallows Part 2 is still by no means a good game, but it's at least a step in the right direction. The combat flows a lot smoother for a start. I didn't even realize how jank the combat in Part 1 really felt until I played this game. But it feels a lot better because of that, and they managed to make this game as a whole flow a whole lot better. Mostly because they never break away from the main plot or gameplay. As a result, this game is pitifully short, but I'll take it over a game that's painfully mediocre and padded to hell. So as faint as that praise is, this is definitely the superior of the 2 games. It makes me feel like they really should have just made a feature-length game for both parts and made it into a single game as opposed to splitting them up like the movies did. Essentially, Deathly Hallows Part 2's core gameplay is more of the same, but they basically cut out everything else. No stealth, no RPG elements, no subtitles for some reason. But this is actually to the game's benefit. While the core gameplay isn't great, all the things that were surrounding the core gameplay was just awful. So it's more repetitive, but it's tolerable repetition. Plus, it gave me one of the biggest laughs I've had for a while. There was a moment where the relative positioning of the ground messed up, and believe it or not, I'm walking on air. Jesus, that was funny. They had some Uncharted-style forced running sequences, as well as some one-on-one duels, but it's all relatively tolerable. It's worth noting that both Part 1 and 2 are basically entirely linear, unlike the rest of the series, which at least made a token effort to be open outside of Goblet of Fire. I'm of 2 minds about this. On one hand, exploration is in the series' DNA, and if nothing else, that was always a highlight. But then again, these games are more globe-trotting and battle-heavy, so being open wouldn't have been practical. Plus, at least that means it's all action all the time and you don't have to worry about a commute. So in this case, I'm actually fine with it. And to be honest, I don't really have anything else to say beyond that. What you see is what you get, and I would have been pissed if I paid $60 for this back in the day, but it's still better than what we got in Part 1. Still, there's no denying that this game just simply isn't good. Bottom line, it's one note, it's boring, it's repetitive, but at least it's a slight step up. Now, of course I've only talked about the mainline numbered entries in this particular series of games, but there are plenty of other games as well. A dedicated Quidditch game, several Lego games, several mobile games, but I think the period of time that really exemplifies the final nail in the coffin for the Harry Potter games as major AAA releases was 2012 and 2013, where they released not 1, not 2, but 3 terrible gimmicky Harry Potter games on terrible gimmicky hardware. Book of Spells and Book of Potions on the PlayStation Move, and most famously, Harry Potter for the Kinect. I haven't played any of these because I'm not spending money on that, but you don't need to be a rocket surgeon to know these games were just awful, and the critical reception speaks for itself. Although I did see a hilarious video of Harry Potter on Connect where the game wouldn't scan his face for ages, so decided to just grab the nearest thing to hand, a Sonic the Hedgehog plush, and it worked. So he played through the game as disfigured Sonic the Hedgehog the Wizard, just like many a fanfiction before it. In any case, I consider this to be the end of the original era of mainline games. Once the movies were done, the series was going to have a hard time maintaining cultural relevance, and there was nothing new to tie into. So naturally, they couldn't creatively or monetarily justify making more games. And EA Brightlight was shut down shortly after the Deathly Hallows Part 2 came out anyway. So that was that, until Hogwarts Legacy 10 years later. So what happened here? Well, I think the issue comes down to this. In the early series, they weren't too bothered about accurately adapting the movies or the world. They just wanted to make fun games first and foremost, and let the adaptation side take a back seat somewhat. The first couple of games weren't amazing, but they were solid for what they were. Fun but slightly mindless platformers with combat and collectibles. But as you started to get further down the line, the game started to take a lot of missteps that came down to them trying to accurately adapt the movies as games instead of just using the framework of the movies to make solid games. The odd one out is obviously Goblet of Fire, but I think that game tried to do the complete opposite, where it tried to be too much of a game, but the game itself just wasn't very good. Once you start aiming for accuracy over fun, that's when games tend to suffer. But then again, the issues for the later games aren't necessarily just for the fact that they tried to be too faithful, because especially with the Deathly Hallows, there's a lot to work with. Well, when the Harry Potter games started out, it was when tie-in games were more viable, back when you could comfortably make a game in a year. But as is well known, when the medium progressed from PlayStation 1 to PlayStation 3, graphics and technologies became more and more complex, meaning that it was harder to make a game to tie in with something that was coming out, at least while having it come out concurrently. Back in the NES and SNES days, you had tie-ins to pretty much every single major movie and TV show, but as the generations rolled on, they became scarcer and scarcer to the point that by the time of the 7th or 8th generations, only a select few things had proper tie-ins. I think the last full AAA release that was a tie-in to a movie and not attempting to just be tangentially related to the world was probably The Amazing Spider-Man 2, although I can probably hazard to guess I'm forgetting something. Either way, Harry Potter games started out when tie-in games were still common and very doable, but you see the gradual decline as the games wore on because it was suddenly tougher and tougher to churn these out, and the developers found themselves more under the gun with every single entry. You can tell based on the declining quality that they were really struggling more and more with every entry, so that by the time Harry Potter 7 Part 1 and 2 had their own individual tie-in games, they were both considered absolute trash, which really just goes to show you how the medium has progressed. Games can't simply tie into other properties the way they used to. There needs to be greater thought put into it, and rarely can something be made from the ground up and come out in line with the thing that it's tying into. And while there was a moment in time that tie-in games could be considered good, that time is definitely long since past. So here's hoping that in the future we get more games that tie into larger universes in the same way as Hogwarts Legacy. Personally, I'm hoping for a Schindler's List first-person shooter. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please consider pledging to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards like early access, exclusive content, and Discord benefits like these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to users GAW004 and FarmCat84 for going above and beyond. Otherwise, you can support the channel by liking this video, leaving a comment telling me what you think, subscribing, and hitting the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Peace!